I'd like to make a request that we address agenda item L first, so that some of the public can be able to leave in our meeting today. So you have any concerns about moving L up?
Well, it seems that we're in the middle of one discussion. Do we want to break it down?
Okay. I think they're all intertwined, so I don't know if they're distinction between them, but, okay, so
This is what I discussed phase,
right.
Actually, if we did discuss it, we were at the point where we already presented the topic. I think Stephanie was here.
I can barely hear you. I can hear you talking to you.
I forget what I said.
we should bring more microphones.
I think you were talking about the fact that we started discussing L earlier this morning.
So we are in the middle of L, we had held that thought, and we made the presentation about the problems we were having getting regulations passed through the Office of Administrative Law that would meet the necessity criteria based on the extensive curriculum changes that the LAB has made to its accreditation standards.
Excuse me, are we continuing with L, or are we going back to the other? If we're continuing with L, I think Andy need to.
Oh.
So let's figure out what we're going to do first, so Andy knows what he
Okay. Right, okay.
So, which item are we on?
Okay, broad item L.
Sorry.
So we were in the, go ahead, Christine.
Go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, we had made our presentation as to the problems we were experiencing. We were asking the LATC to come up with some direction as to whether we need to modify, delete, make changes to our proposed regulations to 2620.5. And Stephanie Landerman was about to talk about the problem. But I think actually offer solutions on how you thought we could solve this problem.
Sure, come back. Sure.
Thank you, Jim Chicot, committee members. As we were discussing a bit earlier, I believe there's a way to write these regulations that is defensible by removing some of the questions that were brought up by OADL, the Office of Administrative Law. That being the elements that are what I would consider variable would be placed upon the two extension programs to use and defend in the self-evaluation report, which is required. That being said, if a program is being reviewed and the last LAAB report existed and it had certain criteria of curriculum, say it's 2016 and we're reviewed, our next review is going to be 2018, we would have 2 years to implement those changes and to substantiate the reason we did to the committee who is reviewing this. That is a much easier way than allowing this variable review, which LAAB does, to maintain currency because of federal law, to affect something like state law, which is very difficult to change in a manner that isn't just basing it on changing criteria that has another defensible element that isn't necessarily defensible to us. So I think creating a process that removes these variables will be easier, first of all, for staff to implement and to arrange, for the review committees to use. And it puts the onus on the two extension programs to present which criteria they have been adhering to and to justify it, which would be the case with it either in there or not. So I would just say I would be also, I'm offering Eddie and myself, with his permission, to assist staff in this endeavor. And I would, if you feel that it is better dealt with in the education subcommittee, I certainly defer to you all in your expertise and expectation. It may seem awkward to have the two extension programs who are going to be subject to the changes in the rules and regulations being party to it. However, if that's the fear, I can understand that. I do think no one else sort of knows what we do, so it's kind of difficult decision-making if one of us is not involved in this, at least a consultant. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, or if that's sufficient. Thank you.
Madam Chair, question. Stephanie, why do you need an accreditation?
I'm sorry?
Why do you need an accreditation?
Well, it's not accreditation. Accreditation, the terms are so interchangeably used.
Okay, so why do you need a blessing from the state?
Well, first of all, it says there's an approval process, an approved extension certificate.
Okay.
So according to law, there has to be an approval process because of that, and that was part of the reason this started many years ago. That process, though, can either be simple or complicated.
Okay.
I think what the dilemma was, Mr. Trescott, was that Margaret was that we chose to mimic LAAB, which has other ramifications for universities of community to try to make sure all the programs that are landscape architecture programs use the same standards. So there's a general understanding that if you're getting a degree in landscape architecture, you have certain pieces of area of expertise that you're.
Yeah, I understand. And so it could be as simple as a letter from both programs outlining the curriculum that's current to their extension program that is submitted to LAPC for consideration and approval. It's just as simple as that. I know I'm oversimplifying it, but it can be that simple.
Well, it could be that simple. First of all, it's already written to law what the curriculum is.
Okay.
If you didn't change that, if you deviated from it, you still don't have a process for approval. And just us presenting something would not necessarily be a process for approval.
It's
Or an appeal.
If it's brought to this body, it is a process.
Well, it would have to be written into law, that's what the process is. However, and I would like to just give you a little more information.
Yeah, please.
It's not just the curriculum that is the issue.
Right.
It is the qualifications of the educational staff. And how many people are licensed landscape architects, whether we're teaching health, safety, and welfare, which until this year were not in the LAAB requirements, it wasn't required. The LAAB's requirement does not require that you have a percentage of licensed individuals teaching, and I know for a fact that it's an important issue in our board for that reason. So there are a couple of other elements in there. I don't think it has to be as complicated as LAAB, and I don't think it should be as simple as, a list. I do think it can be simplified, and I think it can be straightforward. And unfortunately, Sean Lestrade had to leave, but he was here for one of the reviews, and he was going to talk to it. But he had another, he is working signature role. But I do think one of the check, it's a checks and balances.
Right.
Although we don't offer a degree, that's why we're not eligible for LAAB review. it is only eligible to first degree accredited institutions. So Berkeley, their master's program is LAAB accredited. Their undergraduate program is not, so it is considered a first degree. So is USC. Both of the programs here at Cal College Pomona are accredited. It's a very costly matter. We bear the cost of the accreditation group who comes, they interview the students. They find out from students whether or not the students feel the education is up to par. They find out from the instructors how the whole community works, whether it's a strong community, whether it's a dictatorship, which I promise you it's not, although I could.
But I'm sorry, that process, is that required?
Well, if you are going to, and I think it's like I was saying, the lacing together of all of the requirements. Our program meets the same educational years as a master's or a bachelor's program that is accredited by LAAB. For that reason, we need to have the same kind of review process so that equality is balanced. Now, as long as I'm there, I must tell you, I'm not gonna lower the standards, and we've always kept in touch with you. But it's it says right now in the regs that a landscape architect, a licensed landscape architect, has to be the head of the program. For a while, Berkeley did not, their extension program did not have a licensed landscape architect as head of the program. And so that was a problem. I must tell you, my pay is not on par with many principals. And getting people who want to do this sometimes is a question that then the universities, whether it's an accredited program or it's a credentialed program, sometimes the monetary end game is what deans deal with as opposed to it meeting certain educational requirements. So it's a checks and balances for that reason. And I don't want to take the whole.
Yeah, I don't want to expand this.
Okay, well, so a couple things. So and I guess this is for Rachel, is the self-evaluation reporting system, is that something that could work within the DCA's requirements?
Well, that's what we have been doing. We did have a task force that I think it was comprised of 3 people that did site reviews, and just really mimicked what happens in the site review for accredited programs. And I think both Berkeley and UCLA are due for this review again in 2020.
Right.
So there is time to, the question is it appropriate for the Landscape Architects Technical Committee to be a review program of an academic institution that is governed by its own senate, they have their own policies and procedures. So my question has been, it's the same situation we have with associate programs. We don't do site reviews for them. We depend on whatever governing body they report to determine what is and is not appropriate for that program. So
You would have to take this out of law. See, because associate programs are not written into the law. This is extension programs are written in the landscape architect's law.
so are associate programs.
Not to that extent.
I think we're talking about regulations, though, not
Right.
They could be amended. And I think there's a difference between what Stephanie is suggesting, a self-evaluation or review, and what Gretchen is discussing. What Gretchen was discussing was a more structured, we have like a site review to go out. And I think, if I'm not misunderstanding Stephanie, she's suggesting a self-evaluation.
May I? We already do a self-evaluation.
But I mean,
And the
not-
site review is to be sure that we're not a male program. There are many programs that are male or they don't have education facilities, they don't deal with their students' needs, they don't have a library, they don't deal with the physical needs of a program. And that is part of the community of being equal to another program. And I don't know if my colleagues back here from USC would like to speak to this, but they might, because if our degree is equal to theirs, and we're not reviewed in at least a similar manner, I think there's the question of there may be questions. That's my, first of all, my concern, and I believe it may be their concern too. So what we have done so far is maintained within the state a kind of equilibrium of review. If we change that equilibrium of review, I think there's going to bring up questions about whether this is equal to what a master's is. How do we know?
Therein lies the problem. Is the LATC the appropriate authority to be conducting? Do we have the expertise to go into a school and say, yes, your program meets, and what criteria are we going to base it against? And if it's LAB standards, then they have to be part of the regulation, if I'm correct. If there's a review process, then there has to be, if you're not meeting the standards, there has to be a stop. You're not approved anymore process. So I think the dilemma we have is we have two well-established programs that are housed in reputable institutions. They're not diploma mills. They answer to their academic senates and to their governing bodies. Why is it not up to them to make sure that they meet the profession's standards? Accreditation for LAB, and the Education Subcommittee noted this in their report, that accreditation has four constituencies: the public, the students, the institution, and the profession. So those four are not the LATC. So why are we the body that is going to put our stamp of approval rather than just saying, we know you're a good program, we trust you to be doing training students or they'll be coming to your program, and so we're going to still give you credit for an extension certificate, but should we be the ones that are putting our stamp of approval like LAB does for other for accredited institutions?
Obviously, I've been on the board since 2015, so LAAD is not interested in working with you.
No,
What about UCLA?
well, UCLA, we are in the extension programs.
Right.
And the extension programs are all for profit. Well, they're not really for profit, but they make profit. they're supposed to break even. One of the issues is that, and I'm going to ask this question, until recently when we had this requirement of the changes of the LAAB, the LATC has gone through the credentialing program of the credentialing of these programs. I believe that the question now is asked, why should you do it? Why did you do it all along? I think that question may already have been answered earlier on, and now my question is, why is it being questioned now? And I think that the citizens of California would like to know that an alternative education program that is started by the LATC and is in the extension program and not in the university proper has some checks and balances that the state has felt necessary before. Why are they feeling that's not necessary now, is my question.
Well, if I can read between the lines, I think probably some of, I think the issue is probably if we're trying to keep up with LAAB and they're changing the things every 2 years, it's probably need another staff person to just kind of be handling that kind of thing. So
Indeed.
yeah. So we have, so this self-evaluation report, you've been doing it, right?
Okay, along with, I'll give you just a quick, we prepare a self-evaluation report, which takes about a year. We have all of these metrics that we have to keep track of, how many students we have, what is the diversity of our students, what is their completion rate, how many start at the beginning and complete, whether they go on to licensure. We also have what are our facilities like? Do we provide libraries? Do we provide scholarships? All of this information is gathered. Because this is an education component that was invented by law. So it's not like it came out of another academic body. It came out of the state board at that time. So we prepare all that information, and then a site visit occurs in which the board members come. We pay for them to stay. We feed them. We provide interviews with our students and our instructors and our deans, so that there is an understanding of support system, of being a real community and working. And that happens in the other universities because of the LAAB. So it can be very complicated, or it could be far simpler. Once we decided to put into regulation the process, and we based it on LAAB, there were many things that were difficult, that were outside of what I would believe OAL thinks is necessary. And that's right, the rule of necessity. Why are you doing this? Isn't this far more complicated? So, but I do want to also stress one element. The last Sunset Review, which I went to, it was the fact that we approved this program that set us apart from any other board, that education quality, that alternative, that saved us from being censored. So if you feel that it needs to be modified, I think you might bear that in mind. And we were at the BP, the Business and Professions rule, and I must tell you, it was our testimony on this program that's being processed that was impressive to them, and I can call that in the Sunset Review. So it's, I think, it's a unique function. It's a function that is maybe complicated, but I think it's a function that has really set us apart as leaders, and I think making sure that we maintain that academic quality is an important role for the LATC.
So, when you were speaking earlier, you were talking about how we can simplify this.
Mm-hmm.
So, you were talking about removing different variables.
The variables typically within the LAAB changes are in the academic criteria. So the curriculum has been increased to include, I think, areas of study that are now very important in the way climate change has affected us. Stormwater management was not typically called out. They're not all required, but they're elements and subheadings within some of the heavier subject areas that are now encouraged to be woven into the curriculum as a whole.
Okay, so, sorry.
No, please don't.
Do we have to follow LAAB standards?
Well, I think we have, I think we as educators should, if we're going to be teaching and providing this as a landscape architecture certificate, we as the educators do, but those variances are really up to us to stay current with our sister, universities. So that's the one thing I think that changes frequently. Some of the things that change do not need to put in regs.
Yeah, I mean, my first comment is, I think we should try to conform to LAAG as much as possible, but I think, if they're making changes to the requirements over 2 years, that's pretty frequent.
It is too frequent for state law to be responsive.
Yes.
Indeed.
Yes. So, those are, that's one of the things that I think if we, I mean, I understand we want to follow LA as much as possible, but, you know, if we could spread that out a little bit, I think that it would be a lot more palatable to, you know, to the LATC staff. Okay, so I think first we need to address what Gretchen, your question. I think as a board we need to discuss that and come to a determination.
Is it the LATC's?
Should be doing this.
Should it be a state agency's job to tell the school and have it?
Do you want to hear other public comment?
Oh, absolutely. Let's get the rest of the stuff here regarding just specifically the this agenda item. Okay. L. Okay. So is there anyone else? Okay.
Showing my face back up here. Many other, Christine Anderson. Among many other things that I did, I also sat on both UC Berkeley Extension approval panel, as well as UCLA Extension approval panel, as well as starting off this very cumbersome program. At the time, it was discussed that we were wanting to go towards something that mimicked the LAAB requirements. And there were various, how should I put this politely, political reasons to do so. And that was to make the extension programs synonymous with the first degree programs, because at the time ASLA was considering a position of also accrediting the LAAB, the extension programs. So there was some merit to doing that at the time. Since that time, that has kind of dissipated. ASLA doesn't really want to consider incorporating any sort of extension program into their accreditation program through LAAB. And so then we started, on the path of starting to develop a new guidelines. And like you've already heard, these guidelines from LAAB change all the time. And right before, maybe a couple of years before Trish left, we were actually on a path of determining whether or not there was a more simplified way to do this, and we actually talked about maybe doing it as a more of a like a policy document or or some sort of like program document where you can do it more as like a desk critique, if you will, rather than it all being in statute. Because that statute does limit us to the way that we can develop this. So I think it's very important that the extension programs really want to be synonymous with the first degree programs, the accredited programs, and it's primarily because of the fact that we've given them a very high level of desirability for people to sit for the exam. When they come out of those programs, they're equally capable of sitting for the exam as someone like myself who graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Landscape Architecture through Cal Poly. So, if we're giving that level of weight, as the LATC is, then we owe it to them to really ensure, or those programs owe it to everybody to make sure that they are getting the same level of education. Which, having sat through those two extension reviews, I say that at the time, at least, without question, they were doing that. I think the big issue for the LATC now is how do you encourage that level of, keeping that bar up. It is, based on our requirements and things that we've done, and things that we have in our regulations right now. It is incumbent on the LATC to ensure that we are giving equal weight and that they are basically that synonymous thing, unless we want to start taking away education credit from the students that are sitting in those programs right now. And I think that would be a very poor thing to do.
Now, I think what we're trying to do here is figure out how to, quote-unquote, deal with the big program.
Right.
So,
I think it would be, personally, I think that there is a means to do it more as a procedural document or some sort of policy, desk policy procedure, rather than trying to put every single thing in statute, because I think that gets very cumbersome. You have to open up the law every time, and it just gets way out of control. But I do believe there is a way to do that.
okay, so can I have someone from, some of the staff, maybe Rebecca, do you see any issues with the direction that we're moving on this to, to have something that's more like a policy document versus something that's in the regulations to meet the needs of this accreditation process?
Well, you want to make sure you don't have an underground reg, so whatever it is you're requiring needs to be in regulation. Your staff can speak a lot better to what it is that you should or need to be requiring. So, as an example, just a totally in a vacuum, an example for consideration, not to guide one way or another, but an example of what did we weigh in on and what do we require. Earlier it was mentioned that one program had, I think, a dean that is licensed and another one had a dean that wasn't. And to go back to Member Truscott's question, why does the LATC need, why do they need to weigh in on that? What is it that they need to be concerned with one way or another? Why do they need to be? It is true that there's a regulation that says an extension program shall meet these requirements. But part of the reason I think that making many changes to that wasn't all that successful is because the question is why? Why does the LATC need to have certain specifications beyond that? So that's the portion where your staff is the expert in that realm. I speak more to the level of procedure you're going to need to sort of codify or put in regulation the standards you want. Ultimately, once you decide what standards you want, they need to be put in reg, and that's the whole process. Like I said, your staff can speak to why it is you would have certain standards. Why would you need those things? As Gretchen alluded to, you've got institutions that are functioning at one level, and why is it that LATC would be getting into nitty-gritty stuff about what their dean is and what their curriculum is?
I just offer section 2620.5. I kind of with Christine that there's a simple way to do this, and with Stephanie. 2620.5, the very first paragraph says you must be housed in a school that's accredited by an educational program shall be established in an educational institution that has a 4-year educational curriculum and is either approved under Section 94900 of the Education Code or an institution of public higher education. Actually, both of those code sections are out of date, and so that definitely needs to be updated. We had suggested previously to add the Western Association of Schools and Colleges as part of that. I think some of the rest of this, there has to be a written statement of the program's philosophy. Many of that is good. Much of that is good. I think if you kept it generic like that, where I run into questions is, what's your standard going to be? And I think it's totally doable for an extension program to be filing, to do site reviews, but we have to have some standards set them against. So whose standards are we going to use? That's where the problem lies.
And then when you set those standards, when you propose that regulation, you have to be able to support it with the justification. How'd you come up with it? And what's the necessity? So, even if you simplify it some, you still have that same standard to meet.
Why does this matter?
Right.
Okay, so let me ask you, so I'm just curious, why is it coming up now when they've had this in place for quite a while?
So, several years back, we've been doing the site reviews for, I don't know how long, but for quite a period. The site team, when they go out, they'd say, we need procedures for this. This doesn't seem structured enough. There was some basic requirements, but they struggled with it. So one of the strat plan objectives was to come up with the procedures and to refine the regulations. So that's what we started with, that first regulation package. And it was rejected by OAL, which their standards and their review criteria, Rebecca can probably speak on this more, has been very strict lately. They have been very critical in enforcing the codes that they're mandated by. So we came across that denied regulation package. So in the interim, trying to write up the justification, staff tried to reach out to some of the members. I think they reached out to Linda Gates and Christine Anderson to help us with the justifications. And then lab changed their criteria. So then we tried to incorporate that. And I don't think we should just blame it on they always are changing it, because that might be a reality and we're willing to deal with that. But when we started going through that drill, we thought, well, why are we still doing this? Should we really still be doing it? It's not that we want to get rid of the credit that's granted to the students. It's not that we're not going to be saying they're approved. We're just trying to come up with a way to maybe revise the regulations where it'll still give the two programs their authority to continue in their programs, and then the committee to be at a level where they're following their mandate. I mean, should you really be in that business of reviewing? So we opened it up, and that's why it came at this point. It's not like, we have some ulterior motive to doing it.
No,
It's just, I know it's come up a couple of times, but it's just the evolution of this strat plan objective where it's led us.
And one other thing too, when we decided to, when we were rejected by Office of Administrative Law, one of our former legal counsel advised that, well, you have this approval process, or you have an approval requirement in your regulation, but you have no process. You don't have an application for a school to come to you and say, hey, we want to be approved. And what if they don't meet the criteria and you turn them down? Then what's your denial process? What's their appeal process? And so we wrote all these regulations to cover those things. In reality, there are no other schools who want to be approved, so it's kind of seems a little odd that you would create an application to be an approved school when we have nobody else has ever wanted to offer an extension program in landscape architecture. So that would be kind of hard to justify. Standards that for having arbitration and appeals and who do you appeal to, the LATC terms you have, you go to the governor. It's just a very convoluted and it's just a difficult situation. So to simplify it in regulations, continue the approval process, to continue to give credit, there has to be a way to do that without becoming an education accreditation committee.
Well, it certainly seems that we should try and, I think, simplify the process. I don't believe the LATC is charged with accreditation. The extension programs are obviously very important. It seems to me, I thought this was, and I was trying to wrap my head around all this, I thought we already had sort of simplified the process. That in 2020, there's going to be a self-reporting reports coming back from both the extension programs, and either we as the LATC or the subcommittee of this committee review those reports with the Landscape Architecture Accreditation Board as sort of the bar, and see if this program's in conformance or, for lack of a term, substantial performance, or there's some glaring areas or issues that they need to fix or address in their programs. And then given a certain allotted amount of time, whether it's a year or whatever, come back with a revised report or measures that they've taken to correct those things, and then it's done, and we don't see it report again for another 5 years.
Yeah. And it seems like we can't be like the first. group that's trying to do something like this. I'm just thinking, much of this information should be available somehow or other,
I think we are pretty unique.
Well, I think the trick is, if I'm not mistaken, we created this monster. I mean, it's a great monster. It's where the wild things are, but so we almost, how do you create something and then just set it free and no one's going to regulate that? So it's certainly.
Well, when it was first established, though, when we first started giving credit to the programs, this was not set in regulation. It was, you were granted credit for going to an extension program. There was no regulation that specified what your extension program had to consist of. Correct? Correct me if I'm wrong. At first. But at first, that happens from 1976. I think we first started giving credit in 79. We didn't set anything in regulation until 1991. I'm
But
not
the
sure
first
why.
accreditation did occur in 79. I mean, first review, 79 did occur.
Could have been a review, but it wasn't something that was set in regulation.
I wasn't around.
So why do we, that's a whole lot about this.
Why was it put in? You don't.
How do we get this far to be at this point, this time, having this discussion?
Well, let me read you something that was written by Alexis Slafer. I know I have it. This was just giving a little brief, giving a brief synopsis of how the extension programs came to be. I'll be short, because I'm running out of time.
While she's looking at that, it sounds to me like what the committee is looking for is kind of like, what would this look like in red if we were to sort of simplify, and you're hearing the word simplify. I think what you're maybe grappling with is, what would that look like? What could we see that it would be, this change would be gearing toward?
Well, I mean, the other thing I'd like to do is take it out of the regulation and just get the policy document, and then.
When you say policy document, what do you mean? You mean literally just have a policy that's out there? That's the whole point of regulation. So
Okay.
say you have to have those policies in regulation.
Okay.
So that portion isn't so malleable, it's not, and you don't have an underground reg. But when you decide what it is you would want in that policy,
Yeah.
that's what I think you're looking at. What would that look like that could be in red? And so, would it be, it's just the first third of this regulation, 26, 20, 25? Is it, what exactly are you cutting? And that's something you can ask your staff to propose to you. Hey, this is what that would look like. This is a simplified system. This is what you could vote on. This is what you could approve or recommend the board approve and get the ruling going.
Okay.
That kind of thing. Because I think right now you guys are kind of in a void, kind of struggling through like, what would that look like?
Yeah. So, adding to that, would there be the possibility of Stephanie and your colleague working with you guys to simplify this?
There's room to offer input. I mean, the regulation process is intrinsically designed to include public input. If you want it at an earlier stage, there's ways to do it in such a way that that sort of, the same thing, that builds the public into the process. So not necessarily the kind of forum that you saw with that other topic, but there are ways to sort of set up a committee, and then those can be publicly noticed because there's more than 2 committee members. It doesn't matter if you're on the LTC. So let's say, for example, you have the 2 people you mentioned and a third person, and you want them to work out some of these issues. They can be publicly noticed so that it's not excluding others, because as she mentioned, they're obviously bringing one angle to the table. So you want to build the public into that process. There's ways to do that, yeah.
Okay.
So we can come back with the draft, get it from them if you want it preliminary, and then see how you think about the draft or propose you.
And then it ultimately comes back to you for your consideration.
That's in lieu of a committee,
Yeah.
of a committee with you guys to come back with the draft.
You could always, if
can
you
always do it.
if we show you the proposed draft and you still want to do a committee, subcommittee, we could do that too. But at least start, move it along.
Yeah. Mark?
I think first and foremost, I don't think there's any debate that these programs are really necessary for the state, and that they're incredible programs producing incredible ultimate landscape architects. So we want to promote it and be a beacon innovation for the rest of the country to say, hey, this is another way to educate quality landscape architects. I too don't think that we should be in the business of going out for field visits to for accreditation. I think that we should simplify, if I use that word. But I think it's going to require a little work. So I'm in support of the committee, sorry,
Yeah,
to get the nuts and bolts worked out so that we can carry this for another decade or so, before we're comfortable with where it's sitting.
Okay, so, do you want the committee right out of the gate, or do you want the staff to
I think,
kind of?
honestly, I think the committee out of the gate, create the framework that then it comes from. Otherwise, we're going to be responding to something and just muck it up.
What you could do to kind of maybe put the two together is ask or delegate that when that committee is set up, that staff provides that kind of a draft then.
Okay.
So that way, they've got something they're discussing, and there's something you're moving forward with.
That's
And you can tweak and move from there, but there's something you've got.
fair. Okay, good. So we will table this until.
Well, it's not quite table, it's not that you're
Yeah,
looking
make
for
a motion.
And then you might want to consider things like, who's paneling this committee, who's choosing who's on the committee, how you want the committee structured, things like that. Or do you just leave it to staff and say, hey, you guys, grab 3 people you think would be helpful and set up committee meetings that are open to the public so we can get it. However you'd like to do that.
And if we do a subcommittee with open meetings, I can see that being ready for you for July. That's too much to do between now and July. So it might be then brought forward to the next after that.
May I suggest a reminder that Stephanie and Eddie, both Stephanie volunteered, Eddie Chow, to be a part of this committee, and I think their expertise would be.
Yes. Okay, so, does someone want to make a
I'll make a motion that we form a committee to prepare regulation changes for our consideration. The committee will be made up of one of our members, a member from each of the programs that are currently in existence. And I'm thinking another professional public member. Or 2 member at large, so that we have an odd number. Right? So 2 and 1. That's
Oh, okay.
2 members at large to craft and form proposed regulations to be brought before this body. That's my nomination. Motion. I'll second. Roll call. DJ Taylor.
Actually, you would want to.
I'm sorry.
So just want to make sure to get comments on your vote before it's taken.
Do I have any comments from the public on setting up the committee? Okay.
Roll call. DJ Taylor.
Aye.
Mark Truska, yes. Patricia Crowley.
Yes. Okay.
Tricia, do you think Christella's back to finish item 3?
Yeah.
Okay, so I check on
May I make a suggestion?
Yeah, I think we could.
Well, like I said, yeah.
Well, I don't think we're going to be done, but can we table some of these things?
Oh, okay. That's what I meant.
Yeah, you can. I'm sorry, we're talking about tabling, yes, some of the agenda items to the next meeting.
So you would just call for a vote as to which committee.
I possibly.
You would just be asking for a vote from the public, for example, that way they can weigh in. So for example, if someone's travel holiday to speak to one issue,
Yes.
and they're saying, oh, I don't want you to table that, it gives them the opportunity to at least be heard.
Okay.
So whatever, if you're managing your time and you want to prioritize,
Yes.
you just would want to take a vote on, make a motion, take a vote on whether you're attending this meeting.
Okay, so, let's see, we have half of an agenda item, which was agenda item J, and then and K. And I would like to suggest that we move those 2 agenda items to our next committee meeting in July. comments?
I think we could probably get through agenda item, the reciprocity agenda item, because we're just doing proposed language you instructed us to prepare last time. We've had the major discussion on what the position the committee is taking on reciprocity, and I'm guessing we can finish that in 15 minutes.
Okay, so agenda item K.
So in other words, you're suggesting tabling J,
Table J,
handling K firstly and expeditiously. And is that the motion then to handle
Yes.
K and then table J?
Okay, so we need to make a motion to do
So
that.
it's second, yep.
Yeah, okay. Somebody make a motion to table J and to move forward with K.
And at least J already had a whole public forum, so that's probably a fair approach.
So,
Yes,
question,
yes.
I thought item K was the public forum, is there action items related to?
Yeah, there's two parts.
So if you notice, then the LATC would have been discussing their actual strategic plan objective to get the right.
Where's that?
It says followed by discussion.
Oh, there it is.
and possible action on.
Thank you, I totally missed that thing. I apologize.
Okay, does someone want to make that motion? To, let's see, table J for our July meeting and to discuss K.
Is it a table or a continuance? It's a table?
Same thing.
Oh, okay.
I think that's the same.
All right. I will move that we table agenda items, the latter half of agenda item J and all of item K to our next meeting.
That's not what we said.
No.
It's J.
Just J. Okay, sorry. I was up at 4 a.m. this
You
morning.
might just literally want to ask me to public comment about tabling it.
Let's put it. Yeah.
Okay, so let's
Let's
get.
go with public comment.
Public comments on,
Don't we need a second?
I mean, at this point, we're eating up the whole 15 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so why don't you switch it first and just go ahead and address K, because you'll have to see things out of order, and then you can determine if tabling is needed. I mean, I'm trying to be as efficient as
Yes,
possible.
got it.
So we're getting K.
Okay, so let's move forward with agenda item K.
Okay,
Yeah, we didn't finish this out, is that okay?
Which action?
Well, yes.
Let's go.
Okay.
Let's go to war, it's okay.
okay. One of our strategic plans was to consider reciprocity issues. We've been discussing this issue since 2013. We had language presented to the board in November of last year suggesting that we offer reciprocity to people who can demonstrate if they don't have the education requirements, they can demonstrate that they've been practicing been licensed for 10 of the last 15 years in their jurisdiction. We received lots of comments about that being excessive. At the January meeting, that I believe it was January, we presented language. We did not present language.
The language is here.
Okay. We talked about the fact that 10 of the last 15 years was too extensive, and a motion was made by the Landscape Architects Technical Committee to allow people to become licensed in California. If you are licensed in another jurisdiction, your license is in good standing, you've taken an equivalent exam, and you passed the California supplemental exam. We were asked to draft language to that effect, which we have done. And that language, as proposed, for today, for the committee's consideration today, is found in California Code of Regulations, sections 2615, form of examinations, and it is C1. And that language will read, all candidates applying for licensure as a landscape architect shall pass all sections of the landscape architect registration exam or a written exam substantially equivalent in scope and subject matter required in California as determined by the board and the California supplemental exam. For purposes of this regulation, this is C1. A candidate who is licensed as a landscape architect in a U.S. jurisdiction, Canadian province, or Puerto Rico by having passed a written exam substantially equivalent in scope and subject matter required in California as determined by the board shall be deemed to have met the job experience requirements of Business and Professions Code section 5651 and shall be eligible for licensure upon passing the California supplemental examination. If you want me to reference 5651, which I'll do really quickly, it is our reciprocity statute, not regulation, and it says that the board shall, by means of examination, ascertain the professional qualifications of all applicants, that's A. B is the exam shall be a written exam, and B says the written exam may be waived by the board if the person is currently licensed by a U.S. jurisdiction, Canadian province, or Puerto Rico, has passed a written equivalent to that which is required in California at the time of the application, and has submitted proof of job experience equivalent to that required for California applicants at the time of the application, and has passed the California supplemental exam. So that's what we're proposing.
Okay, so we take action, then this goes to the board for action, and then it moves through another process for action.
Yes.
To become regulation.
Right.
Okay. So we're just at the point of the process.
Yes, and at that point in the process would be a recommendation to the board as to whether to approve it.
Perfect. Well, I'd like to move.
Madam Chair, let me ask the question of, when we had this discussion the last time we met in January, it was a discussion about education requirements, not job experience, right? At least that's the way that I remember. That we were saying that somebody who was licensed in a jurisdiction, other jurisdiction, who did not meet our education requirements. That's what I remember.
Respectfully disagree. We were talking about the requirement for 10 additional years of experience. If I understand correctly, that's what we were to be able to
equate to education that they did not possess.
I don't recall that being part of the discussion. It was my understanding it had to do with the 10 additional years of experience that we were requiring.
I think if it helps to resolve this, I think it was a combination of both. I think what was getting proposed had to do with adding a lot of this sort of job experience years, but in general, this is reciprocity in general, so it does address both education and job experience in terms of what you're requiring of somebody coming in from out of state. Is that a fair way of saying?
Yes.
Thanks.
And to go one step further, we actually had a person who applied for, I can't remember if it's initial licensure or reciprocity with a degree in landscape architecture technology, and we didn't know if that would qualify. So we got a legal opinion, and our legal counsel in July opined that Business and Professions Code Section 5650, which we all take to mean that you absolutely have to have a degree in landscape architecture, says, subject to the rules and regulations governing examinations of any person over the age of 18 who has had 6 years of training and educational experience in actual practice of landscape architectural work, shall be entitled to an examination for a license to practice landscape architecture. That sentence doesn't require a degree in landscape architecture. It allows for it, and it allows for you to get 4 years credit if you have a degree from a School of Landscape Architecture approved by the board. It shall be deemed to 4 years of training and educational experience. So there is using that broad in actual practice of landscape architectural work does not mean you actually have to have your degree has to stamp landscape architecture. So, in applying that to 5651, we've been talking about the education for reciprocity. This is how it all ties together and why related degrees are so important. But to accomplish what the agency is trying to do, which is to grant reciprocity to people who have already passed the landscape architect registration exam, have worked in a jurisdiction and have proven that they are minimally competent to practice, should be able to get licensed in California. And that's what this proposed regulation will do.
Upon passing the CSC.
CSC.
I remember us talking about both. I remember this is what I had proposed.
Discussion?
So my piece.
I'm ready to make a motion to approve this.
Comments from the public?
I've been at this for 5 years, please approve it. The precedent has already been set with the majority of the states, including New York, Texas, Arizona, Oregon, Washington, and our own licensure population, including the intent of the previous language that was proposed. Please, it's time.
We probably should advise you to, the legal counsel was also recommending that the proposed regulation that was originally initiated had gone through the public comment period, and if we were to modify the text, we'd have to do modified text, a 15-day notice, and it would also be subject to board approval in June. That regulation package expires August 12th. If the whole process isn't completed by August 12th, and we charted it out, and we feel that that's impossible to get. So what we want to do is withdraw that regulation, and if you approve this language today, we'll initiate a new regulatory package where the clock will start over, and we'll be able to meet the time frame. But if we continue with the prior package, we won't be able to meet that August 12th deadline, just because of the approval process that's needed.
And even if you did modify text, it would still have to be approved on board in June. So either way, this is going to the board in June, so it's much cleaner to just start a new package like that.
Okay.
Can I haven't been to your other meetings, but I don't conceptually understand how this issue and the issue that we were discussing previously, how they can be separated. Reciprocity and the whole educational issue, to me, they seem to go hand in hand. And I understand that they have been separated, but to me, I don't see how they can be conceptually separated, because they seem to work hand in hand. So I don't understand how they came to be separate agenda items, because to me they seem to be inherently tied to one another. So to discuss them as two separate agenda items, to me seems very unimaginable, in fact, because they conceptually are tied to one another. So I don't understand how at this moment they're seen as separate agenda items. And if the previous motion is going to a subcommittee, I don't understand how you can speak now about having this one being discussed as a separate motion.
Okay, in the interest of time, we recognize your comments, and I would like to have someone call for a motion, or call for a motion. Okay.
Patricia,
Yes.
can I ask, when Bridget mentioned 10 years out of 15, what are the number of years that are really referenced for this? I don't see any number of years in here.
There are no years. If you're licensed in another jurisdiction,
For like a
that's
year,
the exam.
A day.
a day. I agree with your comment. They're tied together.
I make a motion, I do not have a second.
I'll second. I didn't know there was a motion.
Could you repeat the motion?
My motion is to simply approve this written language and to approve it and move it forward to the Board of Architects.
And recommend approval to the board.
I still second.
Okay. Can we have a roll?
Now you would call for public comment.
I did call for public comment.
And now you have a seconded motion on the floor that you're about to vote on, so.
Okay. Some additional public comment?
Yes.
Yes.
What is the protest procedure for this to the CAB?
If you're curious about more opportunities for public comment, there's going to be the California Architects Board meeting, which is when they would look at the language being recommended to them. And then when the rulemaking process moves, assuming it were to move forward, then there's a 45-day comment period as well.
Thank you.
Also comments?
And by the way, just to I guess make that more concrete, the rulemaking process requires the regulatory body to respond to any comments it receives. So it's not that it's just this 45-day window that is just a vacuum. Then they respond in their rulemaking package, and they have to address each of those concerns and explain why it is that either they disagree with the comment or that they can justify the rulemaking in spite of it.
May I ask a question on that? Is that responded to by staff? They send it back to staff to respond to the questions that are received during the public comment.
Yeah, staff is the one that would be tasked with drafting it, but it's ultimately adopted by, in this case, both bodies, the LATC and the Untitled Board. So in other words, they're affirming what responses are done, and then they finalize their rulemaking package.
Roll call. DJ Taylor.
Aye.
Andy Bowden.
Nay.
Mark Truscott. Aye. Tricia Trutt.
Aye.
3-1.
Okay, and with that, we are going to,
We need a motion.
No, a second look, the one item that you were attempting to table is the one that you literally have a full public forum on, so I think you're safe on that one. You've gotten public comment on that item. You're not going to take action at this point, so I think you're fine, and if you request to adjourn, this would be fine.
okay,
I move to adjourn.
Aye.
Aye. Meeting is adjourned at 1:30.
Thank you all.
So yes, thank you.